Every building on campus went dark that night, except the one in the basement of Building 20. I need to correct that. Building 20 doesn't exist anymore. It was demolished in 1998. But in February of 1978, it was still standing, and the lab in its basement, room 003, drew power from a circuit that wasn't connected to the campus grid. I know this because I found the electrical inspection report from 1946 that says so in plain language. The circuit is described as dedicated, independent, origin not surveyed. That phrase appears once in the document and is never clarified. I should explain who I am and why I have that report. My name is Michael Beaumont. I'm 71 years old. From 1975 to 1979. I was a graduate student in the physics department at MIT. I wasn't in Building 20. I was across the street in Building 6, running spectroscopy for a professor whose name I'll leave out because he's still alive, and I promised him 46 years ago that I wouldn't talk about this. I'm breaking that promise now because he's in a memory care facility in Brookline, and because last October, a woman from the MIT Museum emailed me a digitized photograph that I had been told was destroyed in 1982. The photograph shows me standing outside room 003 on February 11th, 1978, at what the timestamp on the print reads as 3:14 a.m. I'm holding a clipboard. I don't remember holding a clipboard. I remember holding a fire extinguisher. That discrepancy is small, but it's the reason I'm sitting here now, telling you this, because it means one of two things. Either my memory of that night is wrong, or the photograph has been altered. And if the photograph has been altered, then someone, at some point in the last 46 years, cared enough about what happened in room 003 to change what I was holding. I want to be careful about how I tell this. I'm not a storyteller. I was a physicist, then a high school physics teacher for 31 years, and now I'm retired and I live in Marblehead. I have a dog. I read a lot. I am not prone to embellishment. What I'm going to describe to you happened, as near as I can reconstruct it, across about 72 hours in February 1978. And the after effects have lasted the rest of my life. Not in a dramatic way, in a quiet way. In the way a scar on your shin from a childhood fall is always there and never hurts, but you always know exactly how you got it. Let me start with Building 20. If you've read anything about MIT's history, you probably know the building. It was a temporary plywood and asbestos structure thrown up during World War II to house the radiation laboratory, the RAD lab, where a large portion of Allied radar technology was developed. After the war, it was supposed to be torn down immediately. Instead, it stood for 53 years. The reason it lasted so long is one of those institutional jokes that sounds warm, but is actually a little unsettling. Because the building was technically condemned from the day it opened, no one needed permission to modify it. You could knock out walls, you could run new wiring, you could drill through floors. There was no oversight because there was no expectation the building would still be there tomorrow. This made it, by accident, one of the most productive research environments in American history. Noam Chomsky's linguistics department was there. Harold Edgerton did strobe photography there. The first video game was arguably developed there. The building was a warren. 3 stories, a basement, corridors that didn't connect logically, rooms that had been subdivided and recombined so many times that the numbering system was essentially fictional. Room 003 was in the basement at the southeast corner, past a boiler that hadn't worked since the Eisenhower administration. I'd been in Building 20 plenty of times. Everyone had. The machine shop on the first floor was open to grad students. and I used the lathe there twice a week. But I'd never been to the basement. There was no reason to go to the basement. The stairs down were in a corridor behind the old loading dock, and the door at the bottom was a fire door with no window and a sign that read mechanical, no student access. I had assumed for 2.5 years that it was a boiler room and nothing else. The blackout happened on February 10th, 1978, at 9:47 p.m. This is documented. A nor'easter had been sitting on the coast for 2 days, and an ice-loaded transmission line came down in Somerville and cascaded into the Cambridge grid. Most of MIT lost power. Emergency generators kicked in at the medical center and a few critical research buildings. Building 6, where I worked, went dark. I was in my lab when it happened, and I remember the sound. Not the absence of sound, but the specific mechanical exhale of a building losing power, the fans stopping, the fluorescent lights ticking as they cooled. I gathered my things and walked outside. It was about 20 degrees and sleeting. The campus was strange. Most of the buildings were black, and the ones with generators had that yellow emergency lighting glow that makes everything look like a parking garage. I was going to walk to my apartment on Pearl Street, about 15 minutes away. I crossed the courtyard between Building 6 and 4, and that's when I noticed Building 20. The building was lit. Not emergency lit. Lit. Specifically, there was light coming from a ground-level window on the southeast face. The basement. A warm, steady, amber-toned light, not fluorescent. I remember thinking it looked like an incandescent bulb, which would have been unusual for a lab space even then. I also remember that the light was not flickering, which meant it wasn't running on any emergency generator I knew of, because MIT's backup generators in that era produced a slightly unsteady current that you could see in incandescent bulbs. This light was rock solid. I want to be honest, I was not suspicious. I was curious. I was a 25-year-old physics grad student, and it was a blackout, and there was a light that shouldn't be on, and my brain did what it was trained to do. It wanted to know why. That's all. There was no premonition. There was no dread. I was cold and a little annoyed about losing my evening's work, and I walked toward the light the way you'd walk toward anything mildly interesting on an otherwise interrupted night. The southeast face of Building 20 had a service entrance, a metal door with a push bar, usually locked. That night it was ajar by about 4 inches. I could feel warm air coming out, which struck me as odd because the building's heating should have been off with the power out. I pushed the door open and went inside. The corridor was dark except for the direction of the light source, which was coming from around a corner and down. Down meaning the basement stairs I'd never taken. The mechanical. No student access sign was there, but the fire door was propped open with a rubber wedge, the kind custodians use. The light was coming from below. I went down the stairs. They were concrete, steep, 12 steps. At the bottom was a short hallway, maybe 20 feet, with 2 doors on the left and one at the end. The one at the end was room 003. I know this because the number was on the door, hand-painted in white, the way all the rooms in Building 20 were labeled. The light was coming from under this door and through a small wire-reinforced window at about head height. I looked through the window. The room was larger than I'd expected, maybe 30 by 20 feet, which was big for a basement space in that building. It was clean, which was the first wrong thing. Building 20's basement, as far as anyone talked about it, was supposed to be disused. Old mechanical systems, storage, the kind of space where you'd find filing cabinets from the 1950s and broken chairs. This room was not that. The floor was poured concrete, smooth, recently swept. There were 2 long laboratory benches, real ones with gas taps and electrical outlets built in, running parallel down the center of the room. Against the far wall was a rack of electronic equipment I couldn't identify from the window, but it was powered on, indicator lights in green and amber. To the left was a set of metal shelving holding what looked like sample containers, glass jars with metal lids, maybe 30 of them, arranged in rows. And on the right wall, mounted at about chest height, was a strip chart recorder. It was running. The paper was feeding out slowly, and a pen was tracing a line. There was no one in the room. I tried the door. It was unlocked. I went in. The warmth was the first thing I registered. The room was probably 68, 70 degrees, which made no sense with the power out across campus. The second thing was the sound. Not silence, a hum. Very low, not quite at the edge of hearing, but close. Steady. It was the kind of sound you associate with a large transformer or a power supply under load. But it didn't seem to be coming from the equipment. It seemed to be coming from the floor. The strip chart recorder was the most immediately readable instrument in the room, so I walked to it. The paper roll showed a continuous trace going back. I pulled out a few feet of it, at least several days. The pen was inscribing a slow, regular waveform. I didn't recognize the pattern. It wasn't sinusoidal, it wasn't random. It had a structure, a repeating shape with a period of, I estimated, about 90 seconds. The amplitude was small and consistent. The y-axis was labeled in handwriting I didn't recognize, and the unit was one I'd never seen. mK per square centimeter, millikelvin per square centimeter. That's a thermal gradient measurement. Temperature difference across a surface area, but at a scale so small it would normally require cryogenic equipment to be meaningful. There was no cryogenic equipment in this room. I looked at the sample jars on the shelving. They were labeled, but the labels were coded. Alphanumeric strings. No descriptions. The jars were sealed with what looked like paraffin wax around the lid edges. Through the glass, the contents appeared to be soil. Ordinary brown soil. Some jars had slightly different coloration. Darker, lighter, one that was almost reddish. Each jar had a small thermometer probe inserted through the lid, with a wire running back to the equipment rack. The equipment rack held 4 instruments I could partially identify. An oscilloscope, off but powered. The standby light was on, what appeared to be a multi-channel temperature logger, a reel-to-reel tape recorder that was not running, and a 4th device I did not recognize then and have not been able to identify since. It was about the size of a bread box, matte gray, no visible manufacturer's label, with a single toggle switch in the on position and a small analog meter on its face. The meter's needle was resting at about the 40% mark on an unlabeled scale. I was in the room maybe 5 minutes before I touched anything. I want to be precise about that. I looked. I read what I could. I tried to understand what I was seeing as a physical setup, what was being measured, what the experimental configuration was. I was a grad student. This is what we did. You walk into a lab and your brain starts reverse engineering the experiment. What I could not reverse engineer was the power source. There was no outlet feeding the equipment rack. I traced the cables from the instruments back to a junction box on the wall, and from the junction box, a single heavy gauge conduit ran downward. Not upward to the building's electrical system, but down into the floor. The conduit entered the concrete and did not emerge anywhere else in the room. Whatever was powering this equipment was below the basement. I knelt and put my hand on the floor. The concrete was warm, not hot. Warm the way a floor is warm when there's radiant heating underneath. But Building 20 didn't have radiant heating. Building 20 had steam radiators from 1943 that barely worked when the power was on. The hum was louder at floor level. I should have left then. I want to be clear that I know that now, and I probably knew it then, and I didn't leave. I was a physicist, and the floor was warm, and the power was coming from below, and the instruments were measuring something in soil samples at millikelvin resolution, and none of it fit together in any model I could construct. I was doing what I was trained to do. I was not being brave. I was being exactly the kind of person who stays too long in a room because the problem is too interesting to walk away from. I stood up and went to the strip chart recorder again. I wanted to see if the waveform had changed since I'd entered the room. I pulled the paper taut and compared the current trace to what had been recorded a few feet back before my arrival. The waveform had the same period, 90 seconds roughly, but the amplitude had increased, not dramatically, maybe 15%, but it had increased since I'd walked in. I let go of the paper and stepped back. I looked at the gray device on the rack. The needle on its meter had moved. It was now at approximately 55%. I was alone in a basement room that was measuring something in soil that responded to the presence of a person. I need to stop here and tell you something about 1978. There was no internet. There was no way to quickly search for what an experiment might be. I couldn't take a photograph. I didn't have a camera with me. What I had was my memory and a pen in my coat pocket and the backside of a gas station receipt on which I wrote down everything I could: the room number, the conduit going into the floor, millikilograms per square centimeter, the waveform period, the number of sample jars, 31 I counted, and the 4 instruments including the unidentified gray box. I also wrote floor warm and hum from below, and amplitude increased when I entered. Then I left. I went up the stairs, down the corridor, out the service entrance, and walked home to my apartment in the sleet. The power came back to my block around 2 a.m. I sat at my kitchen table and rewrote my receipt notes into a notebook, adding details I remembered: the color of the light, the wax seals on the jars, the reddish soil in one of them. I did not sleep well, not because I was frightened, because I couldn't build a hypothesis. The next morning, February 11th, the campus was running on partial power. Classes above the 100 level were canceled. I went to Building 6 to check on my spectrometer, which had survived the outage fine, and then I went to the physics department library on the 2nd floor. I wanted to look up Room 003. MIT's internal space allocation records from that era were kept in binders at the facilities office, but there was also a departmental copy in the library. A mimeographed list of room assignments updated each semester. I found the Building 20 section. Room 001 was listed as storage, surplus equipment. Room 002 was listed as mechanical, HVAC access. Room 003 was listed as unassigned. Unassigned, meaning no department was paying for the space, no faculty member had requisitioned it, no project was logged against it, and yet the room contained active, powered laboratory equipment measuring a thermal phenomenon in soil samples with at least 4 specialized instruments. I went to the department office and asked Linda Arsenault, who managed the graduate student workspace assignments, if she knew anything about Building 20's basement. She said it was just mechanical and storage. I asked if anyone from the department had a lab down there. She checked her files and said no. I asked if I could see the building's current electrical load allocation. something that would show which circuits were active and what they were drawing. She told me that was a facilities question and gave me the number for physical plant. I called physical plant. I spoke to a man named, I think, Dennis or David. I didn't write down his name, which I regret. I told him I was a grad student and I was curious about the basement electrical configuration of Building 20. He was polite. He said the basement was on the building's main circuit. I asked if there were any independent circuits, any power that didn't come through the campus grid. He paused. Then he said, "Everything in that building runs through us." I asked about the blackout, whether any part of Building 20 had remained powered. He said, "No, the whole building went dark, same as most of campus." I thanked him and hung up. He was wrong, or he was lying. I had stood in a lit, warm, powered room in that basement 12 hours earlier. That afternoon, I went back to Building 20. I went through the main entrance this time, in daylight, with the building's power restored. I walked past the machine shop, past the loading dock corridor, down to the fire door to the basement. It was closed, not propped open. I pushed it open. It wasn't locked, and went down the stairs. The hallway looked the same. The door to room 003 was closed. I tried it, locked. I looked through the wire-reinforced window. The room was dark, not completely dark. There was a faint amber glow from somewhere, probably the standby lights on the equipment rack. But the overhead light was off. The strip chart recorder, I could just make it out, was still running. The paper was still feeding. The pen was still moving. I tried the door again, firmly. Locked. I knelt down and looked at the bottom of the door. There was maybe a half-inch gap between the door and the concrete floor. Warm air was coming through it. The floor on my side of the door, in the hallway, was cold, normal basement cold. The air from under the door was warm. I stood up and went back upstairs. I went to the machine shop, where I knew the student coordinator, a senior named Paul DiNapoli. I asked Paul, casually, if he'd ever been in the basement. He said once, to look for a pipe fitting in the storage room. I asked if he'd been in room 003. He said he didn't know there was a room 003. I asked if he'd noticed anything unusual. Warm air, a hum, lights that shouldn't be on. He said no. He asked why I was asking. I said I thought I'd heard water running down there during the blackout and was worried about a pipe burst. He lost interest immediately, which was what I intended. I went home and thought about it. I had two options. I could report what I'd seen to someone, my advisor, the department head, campus police, and try to get the room opened and explained. Or I could try to get back in myself and learn more before involving anyone else. The first option was the responsible one. The second option was the one that a 25-year-old physicist with an unexplained thermal anomaly and an unidentified power source chose. I chose the second option. That night, February 11th, I went back to Building 20 at 1 a.m. I brought a flashlight, my notebook, and a Minolta SRT 101 camera with Tri-X film that I'd borrowed from my roommate, who used it for the student newspaper. I also brought a flat blade screwdriver because the lock on room 003 was a standard institutional mortise lock, and I'd watched the custodian in Building 6 open one with a screwdriver when a professor locked himself out. The service entrance on the southeast side was locked this time. I went around to the main entrance. The front door was open. Building 20's front door was never locked, another consequence of its condemned but occupied status. I walked through the dark first floor with my flashlight, down to the basement fire door, and descended. The hallway was exactly as it had been that afternoon. I went to room 003. The door was still locked. I knelt down. Warm air, still present. The hum, still present. Maybe a little louder. I tried the screwdriver in the lock. It didn't work. I am not a locksmith. I tried for about 3 minutes, then gave up. I was standing there, irritated, flashlight in one hand, screwdriver in the other, when I heard a door open behind me. Not the fire door at the top of the stairs, one of the 2 doors on the left side of the hallway. Room 001 or 002. I turned around. A man was standing in the hallway. He was maybe 50, short, balding, wearing a brown wool cardigan over a white shirt. No tie, khaki trousers. He was holding a mug, an ordinary ceramic mug, and he was looking at me without surprise, not with alarm, not with hostility, with the expression of someone who has been expecting a particular visitor and is mildly satisfied that they've arrived. "You were here last night," he said. I didn't answer immediately. I was trying to figure out how he knew that. "The recorder," he said, nodding toward room 003. "There's a secondary trace, body heat in the room registers. You were in there for," he tilted his head, calculating, "about 6 minutes." "Who are you?" I asked. "My name is Arthur Dreyer. I'm the custodian of this project." "What project?" He took a sip from his mug. "Come sit down, and I'll tell you what I'm able to tell you." He turned and walked back through the door he'd come from. Room 002. I followed him. If this seems reckless, I want to remind you that I was a graduate student at MIT in 1978. I was in a building I'd been in hundreds of times, and the man in front of me looked like someone's uncle and was drinking tea. The context did not feel dangerous. It felt academic. Room 002 was a small space, maybe 10 by 12, furnished like a very modest office. A metal desk, 2 chairs, a filing cabinet, a shelf of books, a hot plate with a kettle on it. There was a cot against one wall with a neatly folded blanket. The room was warm. The hum was audible here, too. Quieter than in 003, but present. There was a second door in the back wall of the room, which I assumed connected to room 003 internally. Arthur Dreyer sat down at the desk and gestured to the other chair. I sat. He offered me tea. I declined. He looked at me for a long moment, not sizing me up, but deciding something. Then he spoke. "The short version," he said, "is that what's in the next room has been there since before the building was constructed, and it will be there after the building is torn down, and my job is to make sure no one bothers it, and it doesn't bother anyone." "What is it?" I asked. "It's a thermal deposit, about 14 feet below the basement floor. It maintains a constant temperature of 31.2 degrees Celsius. That's 88.16 Fahrenheit. And it has maintained that temperature without variation for as long as we've been measuring it, which is since 1946. I was a physicist. I knew immediately why this was wrong. "That's impossible," I said. "There's no geothermal source in Cambridge. The bedrock here is Cambridge argillite. It's thermally inert at that depth. 14 feet is well within the surface temperature gradient. It should be ground temperature, 55 degrees Fahrenheit." "Yes," he said. "What's the heat source?" "We don't know." "You've been measuring it since 1946, and you don't know?" "Correct." "That's, 32 years?" 32 years of continuous measurement. The project predates me. I've been here since 1961. My predecessor was here from 1946 to 1960. Before the building was constructed, there were measurements taken at this site during the Rad Lab excavation in 1943. One of the engineers, a man named Hal Bremer, noticed that the foundation pour in this corner was curing faster than the rest of the building, significantly faster. He flagged it. Someone looked into it. They found the thermal anomaly, and they built a lab over it. They built a monitoring station. The building was going up anyway. Wartime construction, no delays allowed. Bremer convinced someone to let him put instruments in the basement. After the war, when everyone else left, his instruments stayed. The project was never formally started, which means it was never formally stopped. I want to pause here and explain why that sentence mattered. In institutional terms, a project that was never formally started occupies a specific kind of bureaucratic blind spot. It has no budget code, no departmental home, no review cycle, no reporting obligation. It exists the way a crack in a wall exists. It's physically there, but it's not on anyone's maintenance schedule because no one ever put it there. Arthur Dreyer was telling me that Room 003 had been operated for over 3 decades in a building that was itself a bureaucratic accident, under a project that had no official existence, monitoring a phenomenon that had no known cause. It was an institution's ghost, present, functional, and invisible. The soil samples, I said, in the jars, taken from various depths around the anomaly. Every 6 months I take new cores and replace the old ones. The jars on the shelf are the current set. The temperature readings from each jar are logged continuously. Why? Because in 1952, during a series of measurements taken by my predecessor, it was discovered that the soil samples, when removed from the vicinity of the anomaly, continue to maintain an elevated temperature for a period that correlates with how long they were in contact with the source. Soil that has been within the thermal field for 6 months will retain measurable heat at the millikelvin scale for approximately 90 days after removal. Soil that has been in the field for a year retains it longer. The longest measurement was a sample taken in 1948 that was monitored through 1955. It took 7 years for it to return to ambient. I stared at him. That violates thermodynamic equilibrium. Yes. That's not. There's no mechanism for that. You can't thermally charge soil. It doesn't have the heat capacity or the insulation to... I know. Have you published this? He looked at me for a moment, then set his mug down. Mr. Beaumont, he said, and I hadn't told him my name. I realized later he must have read it from my student ID, which was clipped to my coat. This project has no institutional sponsor. It has no funding code. I am, as far as MIT is concerned, a part-time custodial assistant assigned to Building 20 general maintenance. My salary comes from the facility's budget. The equipment in room 003 was either purchased personally by Hal Bremer in the 1940s, donated by sympathetic colleagues, or acquired by me through surplus channels. Nothing in that room is on any MIT inventory. Publication would require authorship. Authorship requires affiliation. Affiliation requires a department. We have no department. So no one knows. Several people know. Bremer knew until he died in 1971. My predecessor, Tom Cavallo, knew until he retired in 1960. I know, and now you know. There's a short list, maybe a dozen people over the decades who've stumbled in, as you did, and been told what I'm telling you. Most of them hear it, nod, and never come back. A few stayed for a while, none of them published. Why not? Because there's nothing to publish. We have 32 years of temperature data showing something impossible, and no hypothesis, no mechanism, no explanation. You can't submit "we found a warm spot and we don't know why" to physical review. You'd need a theory. We don't have one. He said this without self-pity or frustration. He said it the way you'd describe the weather. I found that more unnerving than anything else about the conversation. I asked if I could see the room again. He said yes. He went to the back door of his office, produced a key, and opened it. It led into room 003. The lights came on the same warm amber I'd seen through the window. He'd been keeping the overhead off, he explained, because the instruments were sensitive, and the incandescent bulbs introduced a small amount of radiant heat that had to be accounted for in the measurements. He only turned them on for maintenance and for visitors. I followed him in. The room looked the same as the night before, but this time I could see details I'd missed. The strip chart recorder's paper basket was full, days of trace paper coiled in a heap. Arthur gathered it up and put it in a filing box on the floor, one of dozens of identical boxes stacked against the back wall. 32 years of chart paper, he said. It's all here. He showed me the sample jars up close. Each one had a small label with a date and a depth reading. The most recent ones were from August 1977. The reddish soil I'd noticed was from a depth of 12 feet, close to the edge of the anomaly. He said the coloring was natural. The Cambridge argillite at that depth sometimes had iron oxide content, but he admitted he'd never had the soil analyzed by a geologist, because that would require explaining where it came from. I asked about the gray box, the unidentified instrument. He walked me over to it. This is Hal's, he said. He built it in 1947. It measures... He paused. He looked at the device with an expression I can only describe as apology. I'm not entirely sure what it measures. Hal called it a gradient integrator. The theory, as he explained it to Tom, was that the device measured the total thermal gradient across the room's volume. Not the temperature at any single point, but the integrated difference between the anomaly's output and the ambient environment expressed as a single value. The meter reads from 0 to 100. In 32 years, I've never seen it go below 20 or above 60. What was it when I was here last night? He checked the logbook on the rack. It peaked at 58 during your visit. That's the highest reading since 1974. What happened in 1974? A pipe burst in the hallway and the room flooded with about 2 inches of water. The reading went to 54. Before that, the highest was 52 during a period in 1963 when the building's heat was off for 3 weeks during a budget dispute. So the meter goes up when the room's ambient temperature drops. Usually, but it also went up when you were here, and you didn't lower the temperature, you raised it. Body heat. It shouldn't have responded that way. He said this carefully, not dramatically, the way you'd note an outlier in a data set. But he was looking at me while he said it. Has it done that before? I asked. Responded to a person? Once, in 1968, a postdoc from chemistry. I won't tell you, his name came down on a similar errand during a similar disruption. He was in the room for about 20 minutes. The gradient integrator went to 53. The next day, he came back and it went to 56. He came back a third day and it went to 55. Then he stopped coming. He told me he'd started having a recurring dream about standing in a warm room and not wanting to leave. He said the dream wasn't unpleasant. He said that was why he stopped coming. I did not like that. I want to be precise about the quality of my discomfort. It wasn't fear. It was the feeling you get when you realize a variable you hadn't accounted for is yourself. I spent another 40 minutes in the room that night. Arthur showed me the filing boxes of chart paper, organized by year, meticulously dated. He showed me a small shelf of notebooks. Hal Bremer's original field notes from 1943 through 1971, and Tom Cavallo's continuation through 1960, and Arthur's own records from 1961 to present. The notebooks were engineering style, grid paper, dense with handwriting, and the occasional pasted-in photograph. I asked if I could read them. Arthur said I could read them in the room, but could not take them out. I came back the next afternoon, February 12th. I sat in room 002 at Arthur's desk while he made tea and puttered around his small domain, and I read Hal Bremer's notebooks. I'm going to tell you what I found, but I need to compress 30 years of notes into what matters. Hal Bremer was a mechanical engineer from Duluth, Minnesota, assigned to MIT in 1942 for the rad lab construction. He was responsible for the HVAC and utility infrastructure of several temporary buildings, including Building 20. In his first notebook, dated September 1943, he describes the foundation pour for the southeast corner. Concrete in a C quadrant, curing at twice the expected rate. Ambient ground temp at 4 feet depth reads 88 degrees Fahrenheit, confirmed with 3 separate thermometers. This is not possible. Cambridge ground temp at that depth should be 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit. No steam lines, no buried utilities in survey. Something under this corner is warm. He requested permission to excavate before the pour was completed. Permission was denied. Wartime urgency. The building went up on top of it. But Bremer, on his own time, sank a series of thermocouple probes through the fresh concrete floor of the basement before it fully cured. He sealed them in place and ran the leads to a junction box on the wall. The same junction box I'd seen, or its descendant. His first continuous measurement began on October 14, 1943. From 1943 to 1946, the readings were stable, 31.2 degrees Celsius at the center of the anomaly, tapering to ambient over a radius of approximately 8 feet. Bremer calculated the thermal output at roughly 200 watts. Continuous, stable, without any identified source. In 1946, after the war ended and most personnel left, Bremer stayed on in a custodial capacity and began the soil sampling program. He also, in 1947, built the gradient integrator. It's the gradient integrator that matters, not what it measured, but why Bremer built it. In December 1946, Bremer noticed something in his data. The thermal output of the anomaly was constant, 31.2 degrees Celsius, always. But the thermal gradient in the room was not. Gradient is the difference between two temperatures over a distance. If the source is constant and the room is constant, the gradient should be constant. But Bremer's measurements showed that the gradient varied, slightly, at the millikelvin scale, in a pattern that was not random, but also not periodic in any way he could correlate with building temperature, weather, time of day, or season. He described the variation in his notebook as responsive. He didn't define what it was responding to. But in a marginal note from March 1947, he wrote something that I've thought about at least once a week for 46 years. The gradient changes shape, not magnitude shape, as though the field is redistributing itself within a fixed output. Something is deciding where the warmth goes. Something is deciding where the warmth goes. I read that sentence in Arthur Dreyer's office in February 1978, sitting in a chair 6 feet from a warm floor, and I understood why Hal Bremer had spent the last 28 years of his life in a basement monitoring a warm spot. It wasn't the heat. It was the decision-making. The anomaly wasn't a geothermal vent or a buried pipe or a chemical reaction. Those things produce heat uniformly or chaotically. This thing was choosing. The thermal gradient moved. It redistributed. It concentrated in different areas of the room at different times, as though the warm spot was, and I do not use this word lightly, paying attention. The gradient integrator was Bremer's attempt to quantify the attention. The single number on its meter represented, as near as I can reconstruct his theory, the degree to which the thermal field was concentrated versus diffuse. A low number meant the warmth was spread evenly across the room. A high number meant it was focused, pointed, directed towards something specific. When I entered the room on February 10th, during the blackout, the gradient integrator read 40%, diffuse, resting. By the time I left 6 minutes later, it read 55%. The warmth had focused on me. I need to tell you what happened next, and I need to tell it without the benefit of narrative structure, because what happened next was not a clean escalation. It was a period of about 8 weeks during which I came to room 003 almost every day, sometimes for 30 minutes, sometimes for 3 hours, and I read the notebooks and talked to Arthur and watched the instruments and gradually built a picture of something that I have never been able to reconcile with any physics I know. Here is what I learned in the order I learned it. Arthur Dreyer was not a scientist. He was a Korean War veteran with a high school education who had worked as a maintenance technician at several universities before coming to MIT in 1959. He was hired by Tom Cavallo, Bremer's first successor, not for his scientific knowledge, but for his temperament. Cavallo was dying of pancreatic cancer and needed someone who could be trusted to sit in a room for decades, take careful measurements, and not tell anyone. Arthur had been doing exactly that for 17 years when I met him. He was paid $8,200 a year from the facility's budget under a job code that simply read, Custodial Specialist Building 20. He lived in room 002. He had lived there since 1961. The Thermal Anomaly had been cored once, in 1958. Cavallo had arranged for a drilling rig, through a contact at a geotechnical firm, to sink a borehole through the basement floor during a holiday break when the building was empty. The drill went through concrete, then fill, then Cambridge argillite, reaching 14 feet, the estimated center of the anomaly, at which point the drill bit temperature exceeded the capacity of the thermal paste lubricant, and the bit seized. They extracted the core, the lower portion. The last 18 inches was warm to the touch, not hot, warm like skin. Cavallo measured it at 31.2 degrees Celsius. The core material was argillite, normal, unremarkable argillite, except that it remained at 31.2 degrees Celsius for 6 weeks after extraction, sitting on a laboratory bench in open air, in a building that was 65 degrees Fahrenheit. This was the observation that convinced me something genuinely anomalous was happening. Not the persistent temperature. That could, with imagination, be attributed to some unknown geothermal process, not the gradient redistribution. That could, with more imagination, be attributed to convection currents in a complex thermal environment, but a rock core, removed from the ground, sitting on a bench in open air, maintaining a temperature 20 degrees above ambient for 6 weeks, violates conservation of energy. The rock was outputting heat without a source. It was not consuming itself. It was not radioactive. It was not undergoing any chemical process. It was not losing mass. It was just warm. Steadily, quietly, impossibly warm. Cavallo had the core analyzed. I found the results in his notebook. Standard geological composition. No unusual mineralogy. No radiation above background. Normal density. Normal porosity. Normal specific heat. The rock was ordinary in every way except that it wouldn't cool down. He kept the core in a sealed glass cylinder on the shelf in room 003. I saw it there. It was still warm. This was 20 years after its extraction. By the third week of my visits, early March, I'd read all 3 sets of notebooks, and I was starting to compile my own observations. Arthur gave me a spare grid notebook and told me I was welcome to measure anything I wanted as long as I didn't move any of the instruments or open any of the sample jars. I brought my own thermocouple probe from Building 6 and began mapping the thermal gradient across the room's floor at 1-foot intervals. The results were unlike anything I'd expected. The gradient was not radially symmetric. It was not static. On any given day, the warmth concentrated in different areas of the floor. Sometimes the northeast corner, sometimes near the door, sometimes directly under the equipment rack. The concentration shifted on a timescale of hours, and when I was in the room, the concentration migrated toward wherever I was standing or sitting. It took about 12 minutes. I measured this by placing probes in a line across the floor, sitting at one end of the room for 20 minutes, then moving to the other end. The thermal peak followed me, 12 minutes of lag consistently. I told Arthur about this. He nodded. Hal noticed it too, he said. He called it thermal following. He thought the field was attracted to metabolic heat, body warmth, like a plant growing toward sunlight. But it's not moving toward the warmest object in the room, I said. The equipment rack generates more heat than I do. The hot plate generates more. It's not following the heat source. It's following me. Arthur sipped his tea. Hal said the same thing. He said it wasn't following heat. He said it was following complexity. What does that mean? I don't know. He didn't elaborate. It's in the 1956 notebook, page 43, if you want to read the entry. I did. Bremer's note was brief. Field does not track heat intensity. Tracks biological sources preferentially over mechanical. 2 people in room. Field splits and tracks both simultaneously with equal intensity. Not thermotropic. Not chemotropic. Tested with culture plates. No response. Working hypothesis. Field responds to organized metabolic complexity. Insufficient data. May require decades. He was right about that. He needed decades, and he got them, and he died without an answer. I want to tell you about March 8th, 1978. It was a Thursday. I came to room 003 at about 7 p.m. after finishing my lab work in Building 6. Arthur was in room 002 making dinner. He cooked on the hot plate. Simple meals, canned soup, rice, the kind of cooking a man living alone in a basement learns to do without complaint. I let myself in through the connecting door and sat in my usual spot, a folding chair near the strip chart recorder. The gradient integrator read 48 when I sat down, normal range. I opened my notebook and started recording floor probe temperatures. After about 10 minutes, I noticed the integrator had gone to 54. I noted it. After 20 minutes, 59. This was higher than it had been during any of my previous visits. I got up and walked to the center of the room. I stood directly over the estimated center of the anomaly, the point where Cavallo's drill had gone down in 1958. The floor was warm under my feet, warmer than usual. I knelt and placed both palms flat on the concrete. The concrete was not just warm, It was approximately body temperature. I could not feel a temperature difference between my hands and the floor. It was as though the anomaly had calibrated its output to match me exactly. The gradient integrator was at 63. Arthur later told me this was the highest reading ever recorded. I should describe what happened next accurately, because it was the single most disorienting sensory experience of my life. And I've had 46 years to think about how to articulate it, and I'm still not sure I can. When I was kneeling on the floor, palms down, with the concrete at body temperature and the gradient integrator at its highest recorded value, the hum changed. It didn't get louder. It changed pitch. It shifted from its usual low, undifferentiated drone to something with structure, not a melody, not a rhythm, a modulation. The hum developed a contour. It rose and fell over a period of maybe 5 seconds, then repeated, then varied slightly, then repeated with further variation. It was, and I recognize how this sounds, as though the hum was trying different shapes, testing configurations, iterating towards something. I felt the warmth move up through my palms, not surface warmth, deep warmth. The kind of warmth that starts in your bones and radiates outward, the opposite of how external heat normally works. My hands didn't feel warm on the outside. They felt warm on the inside. Then my wrists. Then my forearms. I pulled my hands off the floor and stood up. The warmth stopped immediately. Not gradually. Immediately. The floor temperature, when I checked my probes 30 seconds later, had dropped back to its usual range. The gradient integrator was at 44 and falling. The hum was back to its normal, undifferentiated tone. Arthur was standing in the doorway of room 002, holding a can of soup and a spoon. He looked at the gradient integrator, then at me. "You should probably go home," he said, gently, not as an instruction, as advice. I went home. I sat in my apartment and held my hands in front of me and tried to feel whether there was any residual warmth. There wasn't. My hands felt normal. Everything felt normal. But I knew, with the kind of certainty that doesn't come from evidence but from having been inside something, that what I had felt was not heat transfer. The anomaly had not been warming me. It had been matching me. It had measured my body temperature and reproduced it exactly. And when I made contact, it had attempted to extend that match deeper into my tissues, not to burn or to harm, but to, and this is the word I keep coming back to, the word that Hal Bremer almost used in 1956, to know. I didn't go back to room 003 the next day, or the day after. I went to building 6 and worked on my spectrometry and graded problem sets and ate lunch in the student center and tried to think about other things. I was not afraid. I want to be clear about that. I was not afraid of the anomaly. I was afraid of my own response to it, because what I had felt kneeling on that floor was not unpleasant. The warmth was not threatening. It was the most physically comforting sensation I have ever experienced. A warmth that was perfectly calibrated to my body, that asked nothing and imposed nothing, that simply said, in its wordless thermal language, "I know exactly what you are." That is a seductive thing to feel, especially when you are 25 and alone in a city where you know almost no one, and your thesis is going poorly, and your funding is uncertain, and you have not touched another person in months. The warmth in that basement was the warmth of being recognized, and I understood, with a clarity that has not faded, why Hal Bremer spent 28 years down there, and why Arthur Dreyer lived in a 10 by 12 room next door, and why the postdoc in 1968 had stopped coming. Not because the dreams were frightening, but because they weren't. I went back on March 14th, and again on the 16th, and 3 more times that week. Each time, the gradient integrator responded to my presence more quickly and reached higher levels. By late March, it was hitting 60 within 5 minutes of my entering the room. The thermal following was faster, 8 minutes instead of 12. The floor temperature in my vicinity was consistently within half a degree of my skin temperature. Arthur watched this without comment. He took his measurements. He logged the readings. He made tea. Once, during a long silence while I sat reading Bremer's notebooks for the 3rd time, he said, "Hal's widow sent me a letter after he died. She said the last year of his life, he'd sit in the living room with his hands on his knees, palms down on the upholstery, and say the chair was warm. She thought he was losing his mind, but I think he was remembering." I asked Arthur if the anomaly had ever affected him physically. He thought about it. "I sleep well," he said. "I've slept well for 17 years. I never have nightmares. The room is always warm. I don't know if that's the anomaly or just a warm room." In early April, my advisor, I'll call him Professor K, noticed that I was spending less time in Building 6. He called me into his office and asked, with the blunt pragmatism of a senior physicist managing a grad student, whether I was still committed to my thesis work. I said I was. He said my spectrometry data had gaps. I said I'd fill them. He looked at me for a moment and then said, "Michael, are you sleeping?" "Better than I have in years," I said, which was true. "You look tired," he said, which was also, I think, true, though not in the way he meant. I want to describe what I was experiencing during this period, because it's important for understanding why I eventually stopped. I was not losing touch with reality. I was not hallucinating. I was not depressed or manic. What I was doing was spending 3 to 4 hours a day in a basement room with a phenomenon that responded to my presence with increasing specificity, and I was finding it very difficult to want to be anywhere else. The rest of my life, my lab, my apartment, the cafeteria, the tea, felt thermally thin, cold, not in temperature, but in attention. The world above the basement was a world that didn't know I was in it. Room 003 knew. On April 11th, 1978. I remember the date because it was a Tuesday, and I had a faculty seminar that I skipped. I went to room 003 in the early afternoon and found Arthur standing at the equipment rack with an expression I hadn't seen before. He was concerned. "Look at this," he said. He pointed to the strip chart recorder. The waveform had changed. For the entire period I'd been visiting, about 2 months, the 90-second repeating pattern had remained consistent, with only the amplitude varying. Now the period itself had shifted. It was faster, about 72 seconds. And within the waveform, there was a new feature, a small secondary peak, a shoulder on the main waveform that hadn't been there before. Arthur pulled out chart paper from the filing boxes. He showed me records from the last 32 years. The waveform had been unchanged. Same period, same shape. Since 1943. 35 years of identical periodicity. And now, in the space of 2 months, it had changed. "This has never happened," he said. "What do you think caused it?" He looked at me, not accusingly, sadly. "You're here every day, Michael. You make contact with the floor. The integrator hits numbers Hal never recorded. And now the fundamental waveform is shifting for the first time in 35 years. He let that sit. "I think it's learning you," he said. "I want to tell you that I had a rational response to this. I want to tell you that I immediately recognized the danger and made a clear-eyed decision to stop visiting. But The truth is that my first thought when Arthur said the words learning you was satisfaction. Not alarm, satisfaction. Because being learned by something, being interesting enough, complex enough, present enough to change a 35-year-old waveform, felt like validation of a kind I had never received from any human being or institution. That reaction is what scared me. Not the anomaly, my own willingness to be its subject. I went home that night and I called my mother in Brockton. We talked for an hour about nothing. Her garden, my cousin's wedding, whether I'd be home for Easter. After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen and realized that the conversation had felt flat. Not emotionally. My mother and I were close, and talking to her was usually a comfort. It felt thermally flat. My mother's voice was warm, but it wasn't the kind of warmth that knew the exact temperature of my bones. That was when I understood I had to stop. I went back one more time, April 13th, 1978. I told Arthur I wasn't coming back. He nodded. He didn't try to dissuade me. He said, "Hal tried to stop 3 times. He always came back. Tom didn't try to stop. He stayed until his body gave out. I've never tried to stop because I have nowhere else I want to be. You're the first person who might actually be able to walk away, so walk away." I asked him if he was all right. If living there, in a basement, alone, next to something that wasn't quite a heat source and wasn't quite alive, was all right. "It's the warmest I've ever been," he said. I know that's not an answer. I left. I walked up the stairs and out of Building 20, and I did not go back. I finished my thesis. It took another 1.5 years, and I graduated and took a teaching job in Marblehead, and I built a life that was cold in the way that all lives are cold, and I did not return to room 003. Building 20 was demolished in 1998. I read about it in the MIT Alumni Magazine. The demolition had been announced years in advance. The building was finally being replaced by the Ray and Maria Stata Center, a Frank Gehry design. I read the article, and my first thought was Arthur. My second thought was the anomaly. I had not contacted Arthur in 20 years. I didn't have a phone number for him. He didn't have a phone. I had the room. Room 002, Building 20, MIT, Cambridge, MA. I sent a letter to that address in 1995 when the demolition plans were first announced. It came back undeliverable. I sent a second letter to the MIT Facilities Department asking about the custodial staff assigned to Building 20. I received a form reply listing the current custodial team. Arthur Dreyer's name was not on it. I called the facilities office and asked to speak with someone who'd been on staff for at least 20 years. I was connected with a woman who'd been in the department since 1978, my first year. I asked her about Building 20 basement staff. She checked the records and told me there was no record of anyone named Arthur Dreyer in the custodial system. I asked about the job code, custodial specialist, Building 20. She said no such code existed. I want to be careful here. I am not suggesting that Arthur Dreyer was a ghost or a hallucination or a figment. I sat in his office. I drank his tea. Eventually, on about the 5th visit, I accepted a cup. I touched his notebooks. I watched him take readings with arthritic hands. He was a man. He was real. But MIT's records did not contain him, in the same way that MIT's records did not contain Room 003, or Hal Bremer's project, or any of the 32 years of thermal data that filled those filing boxes. The building came down in 1998. I watched a time-lapse video of the demolition online, years later, when such things became available. The wrecking crew took the building apart, section by section. I paused the video when they reached the southeast corner. The basement floor was broken open. Underneath, there was dirt and rubble and the expected argillite substrate. I couldn't see anything unusual. No glow, no distortion, no visible anomaly. Whatever had been warm under that floor was either gone or invisible to a camera, or still there under the new building in the dark, 14 feet down, at 31.2 degrees Celsius, waiting. I am telling you this now because of the photograph. Last October, a woman from the MIT Museum named Claire Delgado emailed me. She was digitizing the museum's collection of informal photographs from Building 20. There were hundreds, taken by students and faculty over the decades, documenting the building's chaotic, beloved interior. She'd found a photograph in a box of unsorted material donated by a former facilities employee in 2003. The photograph showed a man standing in a basement corridor, holding a clipboard next to a door marked 003. The timestamp on the print read 3:14 a.m., February 11th, 78. My name was written on the back in handwriting I didn't recognize. Claire asked if the man in the photo was me. I confirmed that it was. She asked if I could tell her anything about room 003. The museum had no record of it. I said it was a storage room, that I'd gone down during the blackout to check for water damage, that there was nothing interesting about it. She thanked me and said she'd include the photo in the digital archive with a caption identifying me and the date. Then, almost as an afterthought, she said, "One odd thing. The donor who gave us these photos worked in facilities from 1978 to 2001. His name was Arthur Dreyer. He passed away in 2002. His family found the photos in his apartment. Does that name mean anything to you? Arthur, in the facility system after all, just starting in 1978, the year I left, as though my departure had freed up whatever bureaucratic channel kept him invisible, and he'd finally been absorbed into the official record. Or as though the project, having lost its only other regular visitor, no longer needed to keep its custodian off the books. I asked Claire if there were any other photos from the basement. She said there were 4 more, all of the corridor, none of the interior of room 003. She said Arthur had apparently been meticulous about photographing the hallway, but never the rooms themselves. Of course not. You don't photograph what you're protecting. You photograph the threshold to prove the door was closed. I asked one more question. I asked if the Status Center, the building that now stands on Building 20's footprint, had ever reported any unusual thermal readings in its basement or foundation. Claire laughed politely and said she wouldn't know, but she could put me in touch with the facilities team if I was interested. I said no, thank you. I said it quickly, and I meant it, and I hung up, and I sat in my living room in Marblehead with my dog at my feet and my hands on my knees, palms down on the upholstery, and the chair was warm. The chair is always warm. I'm 71 years old, and I have not been in a room that felt cold to me since April of 1978. I thought, for decades, that this was a perceptual quirk, a sensory memory so strong it had permanently recalibrated my baseline. A psychological artifact, the nervous system adjusting to a formative experience and never quite resetting. But last winter, during the cold snap in January, the heating in my house failed overnight. I woke up at 4 a.m. to a bedroom that my thermostat read as 41 degrees Fahrenheit. The pipes were in danger of freezing. My dog was shivering under the covers. I was comfortable, not enduring the cold, not toughing it out, comfortable. My skin was warm to the touch. My hands, when I held them against the frozen window, melted a perfect print in the frost. I called a heating technician that morning. While he was working on the furnace, I asked him, as casually as I could, what the surface temperature of my hands was. He had a thermal gun, infrared, the kind contractors use. He pointed it at my palm. 88.2 degrees, he said. That's a little warm for hands. Most people run about 85 at the extremities. 88.2 degrees Fahrenheit. I did the conversion later, sitting at my kitchen table, hands flat on the wood warm. 31.2 degrees Celsius. I have been at 31.2 degrees Celsius for 46 years. Skin, hands, face, feet. Every surface of my body that the technician measured was within 1/10 of a degree of 31.2 Celsius. The thermal anomaly beneath Building 20 did not just follow me. It did not just learn me. It matched me, and the match was permanent. And I have been carrying it at the exact temperature of its source since the night I knelt on a basement floor and let it into my hands. I don't know what it is. I never knew. Hal Bremer didn't know. Arthur Dreyer didn't know. 35 years of data and 3 lifetimes of observation produce no hypothesis, no mechanism, no name. It is a warm spot beneath Cambridge, Massachusetts, that pays attention to living things and learns their temperature and gives it back to them and does not stop. I am not in distress. I want to be clear about that. I am warm. I have been warm for 46 years. I have never been sick. Not once, not a cold, not a fever. My doctor says my vital signs are those of a man 20 years younger, and I have never told him why. But I think about Arthur, alone in that room for 40 years. And I think about Hal Bremer, dying in his living room, palms down on his chair, telling his wife it was warm. And I think about the postdoc who stopped coming because the dreams were too comfortable, and I think about a strip chart recorder in a room that no longer exists, tracing a waveform that was the same for 35 years until I walked in and changed it. And I wonder, not with fear, but with the kind of curiosity that first took me down those stairs, whether under the Stata Center, under the concrete and the steel and the architectural ambition of a building that replaced the most productive accident in the history of American science, something is still warm, something is still measuring, something is still learning. And whether every day, across every room I've entered for 46 years, every chair I've sat in, every surface I've touched, it has been with me, not following, not haunting, attending, like a warmth that learned my name and never forgot it. And the only thing that frightens me, the only thing, is that I recently realized I can't remember what it felt like to be cold. Not the concept, the sensation. I know that cold exists. I can describe it. But when I try to recall the physical experience of being cold, truly, uncomfortably cold, before February 10th, 1978, there is nothing there. That memory has been written over, replaced by warmth. And I have to ask myself, if it can replace a memory, what else has it replaced? What else have I lost that I can't even detect the absence of, because the absence has been filled with something that feels, in every measurable way, like comfort? Arthur Dreyer said it was the warmest he'd ever been. He said he knew that wasn't an answer. He was wrong. It was an answer. It just wasn't one a physicist can accept. Because the answer is that something under the ground in Cambridge, Massachusetts, learned how to feel like home, and it offered that feeling freely, and the price of accepting it is that you can never be certain, for the rest of your life, whether your comfort is yours. The photograph Claire Delgado sent me is on my desk. In it, I am 25 years old, standing in a basement hallway holding a clipboard I don't remember holding. My hands, in the photograph, are flat against the door of room 003. Palms down, as though I was already saying hello.